Well, welcome everybody. My name is Ben Franklin and I'm the President of the Legislative Council. It's my genuine pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to New South Wales Parliament's Jubilee Room. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on Gadigal land this evening and to extend my respect to elders past and present, to thank them for their custodianship of this land for many tens of thousands of years. But welcome to the New South Wales Parliament and welcome to this evening's event, Then and Now, People Power and Representation. Tonight's event is the first in a series of seminars that we'll be holding throughout this year to mark the 200th anniversary of the Legislative Council, Australia's very first legislature. These seminars are part of a wider suite of events which are being held across the state to assist us to reflect on our past, to celebrate where we are today, and to imagine the future of democracy in New South Wales. The Legislative Council has indeed come a long way since its origins as a 5-member appointed advisory council to the Governor in 1824. Today, it's a democratically elected 42-member strong, robust House of Review and a cornerstone of our democracy. Its 200-year journey has had its challenges and complexities, including, as we heard, several attempts to actually abolish the council. And tonight we're very excited to bring together former and current members of the Legislative Council to candidly discuss and to examine the turning points and the human stories behind the Council's colourful history. We've asked a learned and hopefully very spirited panel to assist us with this task. So can I introduce our panellists for this evening? Starting from my left, Dr Peter Phelps, a former member of the Legislative Council for the Liberal Party and a former government whip. The Hon Chris Rath, another member of the Liberal Party and the current opposition whip in the Legislative Council. Ms Abigail Boyd, to my left, a member of the Greens and an extremely passionate member of a number of committees through the Legislative Council Committee Network. To my right is the Hon Robert Borsak from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. To his right is Courtney Houssos, the Minister for Finance, Domestic Manufacturing, Government Procurement and Natural Resources in the government. And to her right, ironically, is the Honourable Dr Meredith Burgmann, a former president, very distinguished president of the Legislative Council. We hope this evening's discussion will shed a serious light on some of the incredible stories, achievements and people who've contributed to the Council that we can all feel proud of today. A seriously valuable institution of parliamentary democracy in this state. This evening, I will attempt to gently usher this panel through the key phases in our 200-year history as we examine historical turning points and the Council's evolution across 4 major themes, and we'll do these in order. The first will be the birth of the modern, fully representative Council. The second will examine greater diversity in the Council's membership. The third will look at the modern committee system and look at the scrutiny powers of the Legislative Council. And finally, we'll talk about the rise of the crossbench and minor parties in the Legislative Council. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask whatever questions you have on your minds and whatever's been provoked from this insightful discussion. So without any further ado, let's jump straight in to our first topic. As we've just heard, New South Wales came very close to abolishing the Legislative Council on many occasions. A few years after Queensland abolished its upper house, the Lang Labor government in New South Wales introduced a bill to the council in 1926 to abolish itself. Lang criticised the then unelected council as an anachronistic institution obstructing his government's legislative program. The bill failed to progress, but on re-election, the undeterred Lang took a second shot at abolishing the council with a new bill in 1930. Once again it failed, but this time in the courts. The final attempt came in 1961, and this time it went to a referendum to the people, with voters coming out in support of their upper house. As much as we're grateful that abolition was unsuccessful, these bills were important because they provoked debate and reform that transformed the council into the fully directly elected council that we have today. So the first question I have for my panel is this. Can we imagine a New South Wales Parliament without an upper house? What would that look like? Would that have been a good thing? I'll start with Dr Burgmann.
Well, a number of us in the Labor Party have often thought that it would be a good thing not to have an upper house. A leader of the Legislative Council some years ago, Michael Egan, always believed that the upper house should be abolished. In fact, when you stand for the upper house as a Labor candidate, you have to sign that you will vote for its abolition if that vote ever comes up. So it's still... I mean, when I was asked to sign this, I laughed because I at least knew the history, having been a historian. But a lot of members, I think, sign it without even realising what the history is. I mean, the history is that in the 20s, the members all signed and, pledged that they would vote for the abolition of the upper house. But when it came, none of them voted to abolish themselves. So it does look as if the house is with us forever.
Mm. What do you think, Chris, as probably the most recently elected member of the panel?
Well, I saw 1 year in government at the tail end of the last Liberal National government, and now the first year in opposition. I think that if you didn't have an upper house, there would be far less scrutiny on the government, far less accountability, far less transparency. If you look at the way that it functions by its very nature, is that the government of the day doesn't have a majority. And many people would say that's a very good thing. It has been, as mentioned in the introductory remarks, since 1988, no government has had a majority. And that means that you have a lot more scrutiny, a lot more pressure being applied to the government, and sometimes the Legislative Council saying, no, we're not going to sign off on that. We want to slow this down. We want to send it to a committee for further review. So I think it has been a good thing. It works the way it should work, which is as a house of review. And I think it is one of the most successful anywhere in the world. I know if you look at a lot of jurisdictions elsewhere, like if you look at the House of Lords in the UK, or you look at the Canadian Senate or the Italian Senate, they're good. Ours is better.
So Abigail, Chris says that it works very well as a house of review, does it?
It certainly does. What I find amazing and amusing at times is how members' views differ depending on whether they're in government or in opposition at the time. So last term of Parliament obviously was the opposite to this term of Parliament, and those people who were very, very upset about the use of the powers of the House, SO52s, inquiries.
Just explain what SO52s are.
Sorry, calls for papers. This is where we get to basically, if a majority of the House agrees with you, you can request papers from government departments and ministers to basically show what the real facts are about a situation. So we use these powers a lot in the last term of Parliament, very, very effectively. Yes, the now opposition were very upset about that at the time, but now they are wholeheartedly embracing the powers of the House. So.
Dr Phelps, in your inaugural speech to the Council, you actually mentioned that current federal MP Alex Hawke faxed you, that's how long ago it was, a copy of Jack Lang's 1930 abolition bill with the suggestion that it would be an excellent first private member's bill for you to introduce. You didn't take up the offer. Would you now?
No, definitely not. I'm a big fan of the Legislative Council. One of the things you have to remember is that the executive hates Parliament. It doesn't just hate the Legislative Council, it hates the Legislative Assembly as well, because an unfettered executive means it can do whatever it likes. Most executives would like to see Parliament simply as some sort of an electoral college which appoints the Premier. The Premier then appoints the Ministry, and then the Ministry gets on with doing what it wants to do without any interference or questioning whatsoever. And you can see that over time, certainly in the case of Queensland, that's what happened. Everyone goes, at the time, the Labor Party was, rah, rah, let's get rid of the upper house, because it's an archaic conservative chamber based on land privilege for voting rights. That's great, let's all be progressive and get rid of it, and then you got Joh Bjelke-Petersen. So let's be careful about what we want. And while you could abolish the upper house at the current time and get rid of 42 members of Parliament, the question is, are you then left with what is effectively a democratic dictatorship of the lower house, where you have a situation where because of party loyalty and binding caucus and party room votes, what's going to happen every time. That's not so true these days, where we have lower houses which are subject to a crossbench which can actually be determinative of government. But the fact is that what you have in the upper house is an institutionalised system of non-dictatorial power, which can be used in a whole variety of ways. The other thing I will say is that the upper house in New South Wales is possibly the most democratic places in all of the parliaments, because when you consider that 21 people are up for election every time, the quota to get a seat in parliament is only 4.5% roughly, and many get in at that final end on less than that. What you have is a whole range of people whose voices are represented by real people in the community, but who, because of the fact that you have unitary or single member electorates for the lower house, would never have any representation anywhere else. Now that of course also leads to executive not really liking the upper house, because it's got all these people who have different ideas and different views from what they believe should be happening. So would I get rid of it? No, I happen to think it's a wonderful example of representative democracy, and arguably one of the better examples of representative democracy given the small quota required anywhere in Australia.
To your point, I think one of the arguments that the Lang government made was that the upper house should be abolished because it stymies the government's agenda. What would you say, Robert Borsak, to that, if that criticism was levelled today as a member of the crossbench?
Yeah, well, sometimes I think the government agenda does need to be stymied. Certainly modified, certainly thought through, certainly negotiated, and the big role for the upper house is examination and understanding, and then making recommendations. How many of those recommendations ultimately that come from our committee system are picked up by government? I don't really know. I mean, we had 53 inquiries last year alone. This upper house is just so full of the work that needs to be done by the upper house in terms of examination, in terms of debate. It really is at times quite difficult to keep up with it. So,
Can I just pick up something that Robert said there, and that is part of this antagonism is this, and I'll use the term BS, this BS mythology that somehow governments have a mandate for something, and you should naturally genuflect to this mandate which has been given by the community. Well, if you actually have a look at the primary votes for the parties generally, no one's coming anywhere near a majority. You're winning government on the high 30s, maybe low 40s. And the whole idea that minor parties have to defer to this supposed mandate is nonsense. Well, because if you're going to use that argument,
everyone in the upper
Greens
house
have a mandate to do their policies,
yeah, for their
Shooters
people.
have a mandate to do their policies, Libertarians have a mandate to do their policies, One Nation have a mandate, animal justice. You can't use this, you can't have a mandate which only applies to parties which have a plurality. It's a nonsense. And yet that's exactly the same sort of arguments which are used.
Well, we have a minority government now in the lower house. Do they have a mandate? They would argue they do.
Because it's convenient to argue that you've got a mandate, because it means don't dare interfere in what we might want to do.
So, Minister Houssos,
Tell us about your mandate.
where do you stand on this?
I'm quite enjoying sitting here and being quite part of the panel until this point. Look, I mean, I'd have to respectfully disagree with Dr Phelps, as I often have in the past. Though we do find some issues where we can align, I would say that and I certainly don't speak for my colleagues, but I can speak in a personal capacity. I've been a member of the upper house for 9 years in opposition and a vociferous user of some of our procedures in relation to Standing Order 52s and calls for papers and budget estimates. Well, I mean, I still maintain, I'm not sure my staff feel the same way, but I still love budget estimates. It's a bit of a process. But I think, I genuinely believe that these transparency mechanisms play an important role in our democracy. And I think it certainly shaped me as a member of the opposition, seeing how you can use them to uncover what the government is actually doing, but also now as a government minister, thinking through the processes. When I'm confronted with an issue, I will think, can I explain this if I'm asked a question in Parliament or in budget estimates? And I think that's ultimately what the public want. They want to know that what you're doing is being thought through well, and that you're not and they want to understand the reasons behind that thinking. And I actually think that the upper house plays an important role in that, in terms of both shaping individual members, but also establishing that culture of transparency across government. Yes, it can be a bit uncomfortable, but I firmly believe in the institution and the institution that we've evolved to become. I think it's excellent.
One of the things that I think is most important for the upper house is that it takes government legislation and it perhaps smooths out the edges and improves it. You perhaps may not agree with that anymore, but I'd be interested if any of the panellists can think of a piece of legislation which has been substantially improved by the upper house from what the government of the day was proposing in the first place.
Can I just say that my problem with the upper house as it is that we have a system where we all agree that governments are formed in the lower house. Everyone agrees with that. But then we're saying the government's formed in the lower house, it will now govern, except for the fact that if they haven't got a majority in the upper house, they're stuffed. I mean, it's a really silly system. And we see it at its worst in America, where, you know, the Congress puts through stuff and then the Senate stops it. And I just think a bicameral system where you're really saying governments are formed in the lower house, and that's what we all say, why do we have another system on top which says, except when we don't want them to?
Because of democracy.
I think,
Why is it democracy to have two houses?
Sorry, because democracy is not once every 4 years going and electing your local member. Democracy is representing the views of the people that you're elected to represent throughout the 4 years. And that's why the upper house is so important, because all of those parties, particularly the crossbench, are continuously representing the people who voted for them to try and, you know, massage and make legislation better. And I can't recall circumstances where a government has been, in New South Wales, has been completely stymied by the upper house, but rather what I've seen is a series of improvements made.
So you think your Greens members in the lower house can't do that?
So we get over 10% of the vote in New South Wales. We have only 3 members in the lower house, which is about 3%, whereas we have 10% of members, as would, you know, be what you would expect from a 10% vote in the upper house. And the work that we do to, you know, to really scrutinise, to hold the government to account, and to work with them to make legislation better has been like a really rewarding and I think valuable contribution.
This may be the first time I say it, but you'd agree with the Greens on that, Robert Borsak.
Well, I don't want to be trapped into that, agreeing with the Greens. I get enough of that on Facebook. Look, I think the reality is that, yes, that may have been the case in 1988, but the development of the crossbench, the development of what we've done with the standing orders and procedures and all those sorts of things, governments have learnt in the lower house how to talk to the upper house. And I've been there for 13 and a half years, and governments mostly get what they want.
And also, just further on that, and that is, it's not unusual for crossbenchers to be visited by ministers or senior ministerial staff and be told, Abigail, you're going to hate this bill. It's a terrible bill. But if you were to move these amendments to this bill, it would be a much better bill.
All the time, all the time.
A much better bill. So that's one of the ways that ministers actually use crossbench. I don't mean using but to actually get through bills which they can't get through their own caucus or their own cabinet, their own party room, to give them what they want and what they think is a better bill. And of course, there's the usual argy-bargy of, you know, we'll have to fight you and say we're not changing anything. And then they both, but at least it's a negotiated outcome. It's ministers who understand that there is a negotiated outcome to be had, work on that basis, and then go back to sell it to their own respective parties. And that's a way forward, because that's what being a member of parliament is about. Ideas don't go anywhere unless you can count to 22 in the upper house. Unless you can count to 22, the best idea in the world isn't going to become law. And that's what members of parliament are there for. Members of parliament are paid to come into this building and to make and unmake laws. That's what they're there for. It's not going to open ethnic fairs or do Rotary luncheons and dinners or go and hand out giant-sized novelty checks.
As important as all of those things are.
They're completely unimportant and irrelevant to what you're supposed to be as a Member of Parliament. And unless you realise that there is an institutional minority in place in every upper house, essentially, that there is, and you have to start working with the crossbench, and some people call it horse trading of policies. Unless you realise that, then you're never going to get anything through.
Look, I would.
We will be getting to the crossbench
Anyway,
very
I would
short. That's another whole section of that.
Yeah, we've got a whole crossbench discussion, but since he brought it up, the reality is, I don't think I can remember it actually happening in that way, but I certainly know, and Minister Houssos does it too, is that they come into, and we've got this bill, and there are parts of it we know you're not going to like, but let's have a discussion about them. And so you don't necessarily see the amendments appearing on the floor and being voted on because the government, in an effort to get its stuff through, will go and talk to the Greens on issues that they think they'll have. They'll come and talk to us. They'll go to the, well, there used to be the Christian Democrats and others, and try to get a negotiation for something that will work smoothly and properly through the House. And really, in the end, I've actually seen many circumstances where someone, and I won't necessarily say it's me, but others on the crossbench would say, well, no, I'm not going to wear that, and the bill just won't proceed because the government doesn't want to see a failure.
Because, as Peter says, you've got to count to 22. That's, I think, an excellent segue onto the next section, which is to talk about gender diversity in council, greater diversity, I should say, in council membership. The first council that met in 1824 comprised just 5 members, and all of them were men. We've come a long way since then, I think we'd all agree, but it wasn't until the 1930s that the first women entered the chamber as members. They were Catherine Green and Ellen Webster, both appointed as members in 1931. Later in 1952, Gertrude Melville became the first indirectly elected member to enter the chamber. These women paved the way for future generations of women MLCs to take a seat in the chamber, including the council's very first female president, Virginia Chadwick. In our current parliament, I'm very proud to say that 20 out of the council's 42 members are women. The council today is much more representative of the broader New South Wales community, but there is still a way to go. So can I start perhaps asking the women members on the panel? Women like Catherine and Ellen and Gertrude were undoubtedly trailblazers in paving the way for future generations of MLCs. To the three of you, have there been particular women in the council who inspired your work and who you looked to as trailblazers in your journey? I'll start with Meredith.
Well, first of all, I was always very impressed by the stories of Catherine Green and Ellen Webster, particularly Catherine Green, who was a working class woman, ends up in the upper house. When I was president, I discovered that there were 14 busts in this parliament, all of men. So I decided there needed to be a bust of the first woman in the Legislative Council, Catherine Green. And I read up all about her, and I convinced the then Treasurer, Michael Egan, that we needed a bust of Catherine. We did a bit of a trade-off. He wanted some old Catholic guy to get a bust too, so it was a no-knock policy. And so he agreed to have the bust of Catherine Green. And we went out to Alexandria, where the Public Works Department had their workshop where they do all the carving of the stonework, repairing the beautiful old stone buildings here. It was all going ahead. And then suddenly Michael stopped being the treasurer, and the new treasurer was Michael Costa, who thought it was a terrible idea to have a bust of a woman. So and busts are quite expensive, and we were quoted $40,000. So that's why there is no bust. Well, there is now a bust of a woman, but can I say, and it's Virginia Chadwick, and we all like Virginia, but it's 100 years too late. It should have been of Catherine Green. And the other point about women was when I entered the chamber in 1991, the Legislative Council, it was the most feminised chamber in Australia. We had 15 women out of 45 members, because it was 45 then. And we were only a third women, but it was still the best in Australia. I understand we're not now the best in Australia.
Abigail?
I was particularly inspired by Lee Rhiannon, who was a Legislative Council member and then went on to become a senator. The thing that inspired me about Lee was that she wasn't going to play by the rules, and she certainly wasn't going to act how she was expected to act. And I think she had a long history in Parliament, both here and in federal, of doing the things that she believed was right rather than the things that she thought would be popular. And she was very good at calling out the things that she thought was wrong and trying to change them, from the very small to the very large. She was the first one of us Greens to reject the honorific. So we're all given the title the Honourable when we come into the Legislative Council, and we are technically servants of the Crown. The Greens believe that we're servants of the people, so we reject that honorific, so we're not the Honourable. And Lee was the first one to do that. And she was very unpopular as a result. But she's kind of, she's a role model for me because she wasn't going to conform to the norm.
What about you, Courtney?
I think there's a number of women across the generations that have inspired me. I'd particularly call out Dorothy Isaacson, who was a government whip in the upper house, but I was particularly inspired by her because I got to know about her. She was the first woman to be an organiser for the Labor Party. And so I think historically women have not necessarily taken on roles within the organisational wings of parties, and that's certainly an area, and I, prior to coming into Parliament, was the first woman to be the... Can't hear me anymore? I was the first, sorry, my hair's interfering with the microphone. So I was the first woman to be the country organiser for the Labor Party, and so I think I took a lot of inspiration from the pathway that Dorothy took. She unfortunately passed away last year, but I think the thing that really stays with me is that there is a range of women. Gertrude, I know Rose Jackson, one of my ministerial colleagues, had a photo, had a picture, of Gertrude, a beautiful painting that had been uncovered of Gertrude in her office. And I think there's a long history of women who have served the community from both sides, from all sides, in the upper house. And perhaps they're not quite as well known to the public, but their legacy of remarkable policy achievement, in particular through the upper house committee system, is one that is a remarkable service to the people of New South Wales. And it's not done because of the public feedback or for the public sort of adoration or even recognition, but it's just really important day-to-day work, and I think that's probably the thing that inspires me the most.
You talk about women across all party lines, and I think on several occasions in recent decades we've actually seen women MLCs working across party lines to achieve reform for women's rights in the broader community. One example took place in September 1991 when a group of women MLCs from across parties walked out of the Chamber's debate on an anti-abortion bill introduced by the Reverend Fred Nile. Meredith, you were one of those MLCs. Can you tell us about how that cross-party action came into being and what it was like, a bit about that particular story?
Yes, Fred was making his speech about abortion, and his wife, Elaine, was sitting in the chamber, and there was one Liberal woman also sitting in the chamber, but all the other women, every other woman in the chamber walked out, and it was 13 women representing four parties and both factions of the Labor Party. Like, everyone walked out except Marlene Goldsmith and Elaine Nile, which was quite interesting. It really was the women in the chamber walking out. And we got outside and I thought, and it had all been organised by a Liberal woman called Beryl Evans, who was one of those old-fashioned blue stockings that...
She's the one on the left of the picture, I
yeah,
think.
she's there. She's there in the picture. That's the picture of... Wait a minute, I'm coming to describe that picture. And I thought I should tell the press gallery that it was all organised by Beryl. we always used to say that she used to be in Bomber Command during the war, but I'm not certain she was. She had some sort of military background, but she certainly terrified us all. Anyway, I went and saw the press gallery and said, I want you to all know that this was organised by Beryl Evans, that walkout, and they said, what walkout? 13 of the 15 women in the chamber had walked out and they hadn't noticed it. So we had to do it again. That's the second walkout, and that's us. But it made me realise that there are issues that are women's issues in the Parliament. And on another occasion, there was a vote on stem cell research, and all the women were on one side and all the men were on the other side. It was something to do with sperm, which I thought was really interesting. That it was all a bit technical, but that's how it was. And the clerks actually took a photograph of it because it was such an interesting vote. And the other occasion when I felt that women really voted a different way to men was on swimming pool fences. Well, isn't it interesting, the issues that women have very different views than men on? And guns, of course, women always had a different position.
I think one of the perennial issues impacting women in the workforce is obviously balancing family life and work life. And it's been a long-standing barrier, we all know, to women in the workforce generally, but particularly in their participation in politics as well. I want to throw this one to Minister Houssos because this issue came up for you several years ago, and I'm interested in how you handled it, what you did, and perhaps you might tell us of an example that you can share with, might include somebody on this panel today.
So I was, when I was elected, my daughter was 15 months old, and so she was still very little, and one night she'd come in to have dinner with me. My husband had brought her in and we had to go in and vote in a division. Anyway, I thought, oh, well, I'll just take her in with me. I'm just going in to sit down, and she was very well behaved, so she'd sit on my lap and it'd be fine. But because I was no longer breastfeeding her, she was not under those particular requirements at the time allowed to come in. She was recognised as a stranger in the house. Now, I thought this was pretty ridiculous because I'd actually heard stories of in the previous Labor government in the other place of members of Parliament bring their kids in, and it's really up to your own judgment. You know, you're not going to bring a child in who's not going to be able to cope with it or whatever the like might be. I thought it was a pretty logical change in true upper house fashion to get this relatively minor change. It took 4 years, an upper house inquiry, and actually a change in the makeup of the upper house. We introduced a range of changes after the 2019 election, and one of them was that we would allow young people to come in if they're in the care of a member. And so just like any other workplace, if you're juggling and you're having a bad day and your child can't go to childcare or something's happened, you can bring them to work with you and use your own judgment as a parent as to whether you can take them in or not. But I did, I have to say that I think when we're reflecting, this has been a really significant change in the attitude towards children. And in fact, I had my second child, my son, when I was in Parliament, and the then Deputy Leader of the government, in reflecting on when I'd come back to work and I used to bring him into Parliament with me, he reflected that he had been the best behaved member of the House in that particular year. I'm not sure that was the case, but I think it was just really a way that things had changed over the course of even within 4 years, and certainly in speaking to Meredith, in the way over time we've changed in terms of our attitudes. I will do a special call out to Dr Phelps. We don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, but I shared an anecdote earlier where pairs are something that are granted in the upper house, and obviously having young children and different responsibilities, you rely on the goodwill of the government at the time. And there was one particular day where I got a call during question time and had to rush out, and the pair, which is normally quite a formal process, was granted by Dr Phelps, giving me a wave to say yes, I could leave. And it's that kind of attitude and I'll wrap up on this point, which is often, I think, when women are thinking about running for office, it really strikes me that they think about the logistics of how this is going to work with their families. So I often talk really practically about the logistics and the arrangements, because this is a big consideration for women when they're considering, and that's why it was really important for me to get this written to the rules to allow women to know that if they were having a bad day, they could bring it in. I actually never used, Oh no, it took me many years to use the rules, but it was when I saw my colleagues using them, indeed one of the grandparents in the house using them to bring their children in. This is the kind of, it makes for a better parliament when we look like the community we seek to represent, and workplaces across the country are doing this. It's only natural that our parliaments do it as well.
Can I just add something?
Please, Robert.
Yeah, look, it's my great pleasure to have supported that, but I think what you're pointing out also is that the upper house functions in a more collegiate way. And quite often when things are being done, negotiations occur between the government and the opposition, crossbench and opposition, etc., etc. It's adversarial, but not as cutthroat adversarial as you see in the lower house, so, because in the end we're trying to get a result that is going to work for the best interests of the community. And I think in that sense the upper house is very, very democratically elected, and that community is reflected by all the people that are elected there. So the requirements of mothers and other people in the house is, and I've never seen a situation where anyone's actually actively opposed those initiatives when they're brought up.
Of course, diversity is about more than women. In 1990, for example, council member, the late Paul O'Grady, came out in an interview with the LGBTQI+ press. He was the first openly gay member of the council. Dr Burgmann, not only did you work alongside Paul, you're among several MLCs to support his request to join the 1992 Mardi Gras parade. Indeed, you yourself marched in the original 1978 protest. What's your recollection to that momentous time when you had the first openly gay member of the Legislative Council?
It was a really interesting time because it was in a period when coming out as gay was still pretty unusual, and there was still a lot of hostility towards the idea of a gay member of parliament. One of the things he tried to do, for instance, was take his partner with him on political trips and things in the same way as heterosexual members could take their wives. And he was refused, and I actually joined him in that campaign to allow, and the amount of attack we got from the public as well as from other members of parliament. Yes, I found it recently actually, he sent out a letter in 1992 saying that members of parliament should march in the Mardi Gras. Now we just take it for granted now that all parties seem to have a float, at Mardi Gras saying how wonderful they are. But in 1992...
Not Fred Niles' party.
What?
Not Fred Niles' party.
The others. But on this occasion, only 4 people joined him. It was me, Paul, Richard Jones from the Democrats, Clover Moore, and a guy from South Australia who was a member of parliament who was a friend of Paul's, and that was it. So, and he'd sent the letter to every single member of parliament, and we were the only people who marched. So it was very brave of him to do what he did at that time, and he certainly got attacked for it, sometimes physically.
And now, Chris, when you came into Parliament, you acknowledged in your maiden speech your partner Patrick sitting in the gallery, and who's here today, I believe, and there didn't seem to be a ripple. Now, that was from what I saw from outside. How have you found the experience?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good thing that that it was so utterly boring to say in your inaugural speech that you're gay and your partner's there in the gallery. Just shows how far that we've come. But I think that you do want your Parliament to be as broadly representative of the community as possible. And I think you provide a different perspective when you come from a different background. I look at people like Bruce Notley-Smith, for instance, in the lower house previously, who got elected in 2011. He pushed for an apology to the 78ers, for instance, and being as an openly gay man that he was, that he pushed for that. And I think that shows when you do have diverse voices in the Parliament, what you can achieve. In our chamber, in the last term of government, it was something like the Special Commission into LGBTI hate crimes, which was definitely pushed by a good friend of mine, Shane Mallard, in our chamber, as well as Alex Greenwich in the other place. So I think you do want your parliaments to be as broadly representative of the community as possible because of the unique perspective that they bring and the different issues that they push for as well. So I think that's incredibly important. I was thinking about a quote from Julia Gillard the other day when someone asked her about what it feels like to be the first female Prime Minister, and she said it doesn't explain everything, it doesn't explain nothing, it explains some things. And I think that's the same as being an openly gay legislator, is it doesn't explain everything, it doesn't explain nothing, but it does explain some things, because when it does come to something like the recent bill we had in the upper house to ban gay conversion practices, I think that the unique perspective that the 6 members of the Legislative Council had that are from the LGBTI community, I think that was really important, and we wouldn't be as rich a chamber if we didn't have that representation.
In recent decades, we've also seen really important strides made towards greater ethnic diversity in the council. In 1988, for example, Helen Sham Ho was elected to the council, becoming the first Chinese-born Australian to serve in an Australian parliament. In 2013, Dr Meredith Burgmann became the first Muslim member of the council. Most recently, Treasurer Daniel Mookhey was sworn in on the Bhagavad Gita in an Australian first. But there's still some way to go. So, Abigail, how can we achieve more diversity in the council?
This is an excellent question, and I'm going to try and also build in just a couple of responses to Meredith and Courtney as well, because I think we talk about, firstly, when I came in last term, we had a lower percentage of women in the upper house than we had since the 80s. So it was 30-something%. It's now 48%, which is great, but that is by no means guaranteed. A lot of that's due to the Greens,
to be honest, having an entire female membership in the Legislative Council.
Yes, we're 7 women in our party room. But I think now that we are getting to the point where we're having a more stable percentage of women, we need to look at what other attributes those women have. We are very low in representation of women of colour, of First Nations women, of women with a physical disability. We don't have anybody in the upper house with a physical disability. Women from regional backgrounds. And when Courtney was talking about having her children in, I'm a regional MP, which means when I come for a sitting week, I am staying in a hotel and I'm sitting for we're here for 5 days before I go back to see my family. So when my kids, who are still quite young, have any issues, I can't be there with them. And I think that if we're to encourage people from a broader array of backgrounds, that's really important. But also, I noticed when I first came in, just the numbers of there's white men on the bus primarily, but also everywhere you look, it's the place is very much the white able-bodied heterosexual man as the norm. And so someone like Meredith Burgmann, when she came in, she's away from home, she's a woman who doesn't share, the religion of we have a Lord's Prayer that gets read out in the chamber every morning. It's naturally excluding people who aren't of a Christian faith. You come into this environment and it can feel very lonely when you don't meet that norm. So I think we need to work a lot harder on catching our parliament up to date with the realities of what our communities look like, which is why I'm such a big proponent of getting rid of the Lord's Prayer in the morning.
Can I just add to the bit about the Lord's Prayer?
Please.
We tried to get rid of that a couple of times because it's not just a Christian prayer, it's an Anglican prayer, which of course all the Catholics object to. And it's absurd that we now have a chamber which has quite some diversity and we're still starting with an Anglican prayer. And there's meant to be a division between church and state. I had to, when I became president, and the president's meant to lead the prayer, I had to get the standing orders changed, which hadn't been changed for 57 years. I had to get the standing orders changed so that I didn't have to lead the prayer. I was allowed to ask someone else to lead the prayer, but we couldn't get it actually abolished because the chamber voted and always voted overwhelmingly to keep the prayer. And I just think it's ridiculous in our present day. Sorry.
And that will be a debate for another day.
But
We'll need to move on. I'm sorry.
Can I just say one thing?
No, you can't. We will need to move on to the next issue.
Order.
All right. Well,
I
if
like
you're going to
moving aside.
talk, we'll start with Courtney because you have a louder voice doesn't mean you can go first. Courtney first, then Peter.
I just wanted to make one point, which is in the context of diversity, that 4 of the 6 ministers in the upper house are women. And one of those men is the Treasurer, a good friend of mine, and also a very proud Indian Australian. So I think in terms of understanding that diversity and making great strides in that diversity, the point Abigail makes is correct. But I would just, of course I should say that we are the first cabinet in New South Wales to have 50-50 female and male representation.
Thank you. Dr Phelps.
Just on the Legislative Council, if you think about it, they've been far more progressive. There's always been a greater representation of women of non-Anglo minorities in the Legislative Council. And the question is why? Well, people are going to hate this, but inevitably parties and factions have been more important in getting people into our chamber than members of the general public. Previously, you had appointments, then you had the election by members of both houses for new members, and ultimately, under the current system, you have effectively a list system where you go in based on not your personal popularity in the community, but where you fit in the ecosystem of your party. And in many instances, the parties have been more progressive, even Conservative parties like my own, than have been the general public of New South Wales. So what you find, the irony is that the Legislative Council, which is often derided as a bastion of reaction and conservatism, has often led the way in areas of social progress because of that intimate link between the parties and factions and the selection of people to winnable spots on the respective tickets.
And that's a beautiful way to conclude this section. We'll move on to the modern committee system and scrutiny powers. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the cut and thrust of the parliamentary chamber. You see videos of question time and so on. But not so much of the important work that we do in the upper house actually takes place in inquiries conducted by its committees. In fact, committee inquiries have been part of the Council's work since 1825, when it conducted an inquiry into conditions for female convicts at the Parramatta Female Factory. But the big change came in 1986 when a select committee chaired by the Honourable Ron Dyer investigated options for a revived committee system. The outcome was a new set of committees, including the Standing Committee on Social Issues. And that committee's very first inquiry into adoption practices led to groundbreaking legislative and policy change, setting a benchmark for inquiries to come. Today, the Council has 17 standing committees, and last year alone, our committees conducted 58 inquiries. They are incredibly important. They are an important way that the community can directly engage with matters that affect them the most and ensure that their voices get heard back in the Parliament. Robert Borsak, what contribution do you think that upper house committees have made to parliamentary democracy in this state?
Well, I could say they're very exhausting. There's an awful lot of it happening. Look, I think, especially after the post-2019 changes we made to the standing orders, that the committee system is very, very important in, as I was saying earlier in the discussion, that bills need to be reviewed, bills need to be discussed, but even more importantly, it opens the whole process to transparency. And frankly, I sit there and chair or participate in so many committees, and quite often I sit there and think, we're not doing enough on this. We're not getting enough participation. You can, depending on what the committee inquiry is, and it could be something not necessarily related to a bill. You could get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions. Where do you start? Where do you end? It's as far as I'm concerned, it's the major contributor to what government is about. It's not a blockage. I think that question was going to be asked or will be asked. It's not even a handbrake. It's really what, if people out there want to see and understand what's going on in this place, watch what the committees are doing and participate if you have an opinion, because it's very, very important that from election to election, the committee process is how the Parliament actually interacts with the people that elect them. And the nature of the upper house, especially the way it's elected on a statewide franchise, is probably the most, I would say it is the most democratically elected house in Australia. In fact, it's reflective of what happens in the federal Senate. So be there, be part of it, watch what goes on. If you want to understand, make a contribution, because the options and the opportunities are there.
What do you think, Chris?
I think the committees play an incredibly important role. I think some of them are just about scrutiny. So you look at the budget estimates process that we do twice a year now, which is more about holding the government to account. But there's a whole lot of other committees that are subject matter committees that you get a lot of collaboration between the government, the opposition and the crossbench. And it does lead to, I think, really important outcomes as well. And in terms of the committees being a handbrake, mostly they're not, but sometimes they are, and I think sometimes they need to be. I mean, I look at the end of the last government, and this is just an anecdote. I'm not saying I agree with this, but we tried to put through very quickly a policy that I loved, which was called the First Home Buyers Choice Program, basically giving young people a choice to pay an annual land tax rather than an upfront, very large stamp duty. We tried to get that through the upper house in blitzkrieg fashion just before the end of the term. And the Parliament, the Chamber, the Legislative Council said, no, we're going to send this to a quick inquiry to look at this in more detail. And I think that sometimes the committees and the upper house actually do need to be a handbrake on, you know, what Peter said before, the tyranny of the majority. That wouldn't have happened, that inquiry wouldn't have happened had it have just been left to the Legislative Assembly, had we have been a unicameral system, because the government of the day has the majority there. So sometimes, for very good reasons, the Legislative Council says, let's slow things down. Let's send it to a committee. Let's take another look at it. Let's see if there are some amendments. Let's invite stakeholders in and ask for their opinion, because sometimes there is an arrogance of government in terms of trying to rush things through the Parliament. So I think the committees play an incredibly important role for many different reasons.
Who can tell me about a committee that they were involved with which was particularly groundbreaking, or maybe shifted your perspective on a particular issue, or changed the focus in terms of how the committees themselves even work? Courtney?
Yeah, well, I'm going to call out one of the first major inquiries that you and I were on together when we were first elected to the Parliament in 2015, and that was for financial reparations for Aboriginal, for our First Nations people. And that was remarkable because it was a long-running inquiry. But to go to Robert's point earlier about it being a really collegiate atmosphere in the upper house, all of us worked. So we had representation on that committee. It was chaired by Jan Barham from the Greens. It had members of the government at the time, Nationals, and the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, and then Fred Nile, a Christian Democrat. And we came to a unanimous decision about how we thought the government should be dealing with financial reparations for the stolen generations. We worked really hard to get a unanimous committee position that was then implemented by the government of the day. And I think that shows, I actually think that our upper house committees have a really important role to play in terms of scrutiny. I was going to call out the inquiry that I was a part of in the early days of the pandemic. We were at a time when there were no other parliaments meeting around the world. Our parliament here, in the oldest parliamentary chamber in the country, found a way to get up and running, to have some level of parliamentary scrutiny at a really unprecedented time. And that was, again, a long-running inquiry that went through the course of the pandemic. But at the same time, I think sometimes what's not known as well is the way that upper house committees can really deal with complex and difficult policy questions. decisions, and often come to unanimous committee reports, which is really important, and that can be the basis for really important policy change for the people of New South Wales.
Abigail Boyd, what about you?
I was going to talk about an inquiry that I managed to get up basically one of the first ones when I started, but then I remembered that in the course of trying to get that inquiry up, I spent quite a bit of time trying to convince Mark Banasiak from the Shooters to look into it, and that was in relation to coal ash repositories around coal-fired power stations. He was pretty open-minded, but he said, yeah, but on that other committee that we're on that you chair, would you think about doing an inquiry into taxis and taxi licences and the changes that happened when the point-to-point reforms came in with Uber? Now, in my previous existence, I was not a taxi policy expert, and I'd never really thought about this, but I had a little look into it, and it was one of the most satisfying inquiries I've ever done, and it was a real moment of me having to become, an expert on taxi policy, reading everything I could, and then hearing from a really switched on, engaged group of taxi drivers and their sort of families and communities, and really listening to what the issues were. And it was a fantastic inquiry, and it took quite a long time, but I think 3 or 4 years later, we ended up with an actual result where those taxi drivers got more compensation. So I think that was a beautiful example of working across the chamber to work together to shine a light on issues that we care about. It was really good.
Peter?
I just want to say 2 things. Firstly, I'll differentiate between estimates committees, which I think are vitally important and which I don't think go hard enough in New South Wales. I was a Senate staffer, and I don't buy the argument that we should have second-rate estimates procedures
Just
here.
explain what estimates proceedings are to someone
Estimates
who may
is
not
where
know.
you call in the relevant minister and their departmental officials and you grill them in New South Wales for roughly 3 hours, and they dissemble and rabbit on until their time finishes, and then they walk out of there and say, phew, done for another 6 months. They used to say, oh, done for another 12 months, but that got changed. If we're not to be... Good governments come from good questioning, whether from oppositions or from crossbenchers. And if you're a good minister, you should be able to take the pressure of being questioned on your portfolio for multiple hours. Because if you can't, you should not be a minister. If you don't know what your department is doing, you should not be a minister. If the department has held things from you, that should be exposed. And arguably, you've been a bad minister. So I would say estimates in New South Wales needs to be strengthened. It's got slightly strengthened in recent years, but it needs to be strengthened. That's estimates committees. General committees, I think, make MPs better people. And I don't just say that because of the enforced bonhomie which you're forced to engage in when you travel around the countryside and actually have to live with them in the same accommodation, having the same breakfast and the same lunch and the same dinner with them. It makes them better people. But what Abigail said is absolutely right, and that is, in a job where you have no in-service training whatsoever, committees have a wonderful educative effect. I come from a particular background, Abigail comes from a background, Robert comes from a particular background, we all come from particular backgrounds, but we inevitably end up on committees where we have no idea what's going on, and you hear from experts and general members of the public and officials, and you investigate and you study and you learn and you read and you form opinions. Some, like my opinions, already come pre-formed because I'm an ideologue, but nevertheless, you at least have an informed ideological opinion after going through this committee process. So you would learn things which you'd never previously think. And I'll start off with my personal experience. When I first came into Parliament, I got appointed to the Standing Committee on State Development, which is jokingly referred to sometimes as the Standing Committee on National Party pork barrelling, because inevitably it's about infrastructure around the state and, how Galargambone needs a new hospital and Oodnadatta needs a new road, 6 lanes with no tolls. But what you did was you went around and I learnt things about fishing, about forestry, about mining, about geomorphology, about coal seam gas, about a whole range of things which I'd never had any previous experience with. So my time in Parliament, after 8 years of being on committees, many of which involving issues which I had no prior knowledge on, actually made me a better, well-rounded person as a Member of Parliament, but also as a human being, because you learn so much more, surprising things which you never knew about previously.
And as well as committee work, another important dimension of the Council's work is its role in scrutinising the government of the day. One of the powers that the Council has in this regard is the power to order government papers, which Abigail was referring to earlier. Now, this power was challenged in 1996 when the then Treasurer and Leader of the Government in the House, Michael Egan, refused to table papers which were ordered by the Council. And this led to a well-known climax in the chamber when Mr Egan was escorted outside by the usher of the Black Rod. Meredith, you were a member during this period. What's your recollection of these events and how important they were?
Well, it was an absurd situation because the only way the issue of did the Legislative Council have the power to order papers was to get it into a New South Wales court. And the only way this could happen was for the Treasurer, Michael Egan, to refuse to present the papers, and then for our, Sergeant-at-Arms, in the upper house he's known as the Usher of the Black Rod, come and arrest him and, take him outside. And our Usher of the Black Rod, Warren Carl, was a wonderful bloke who did a terrific amount of work with the budding parliaments of the 14 nation states in the Pacific. He was a very, very interesting guy, but he was very gentle and quiet. And of course, Michael, despite his size, was a fairly ebullient personality. And I happened to be sitting next to Michael on this occasion, just quite by accident. And poor old Warren had to come in and tap him on the shoulder and say, "Oh, Mr. Treasurer, could you come with me?" And that was the assault. And so poor old Warren was charged with assault in the Common Courts, and the whole issue was then decided in a fairly low court in New South Wales. However, what was very exciting for both Warren and Michael was that they made it into not only, Odger's Senate practice and everything, they got into Erskine May, which is the Bible of all the Westminster parliaments around the world. So Michael used to, whenever a new, the Ghanaian parliament used to produce a new Senate practice or something, he'd come up and show it to me, say, see, Egan versus Carl, there it is. So it was a really important case, but it was decided in a New South Wales, I think it was the appeals court or something, that eventually made the decision that yes, the Legislative Council could ask for papers and have them handed over.
We'll
yes
move,
and no.
Please.
Yes.
Peter?
It was a three-way decision. One said absolutely yes, one said no if they're cabinet documents, and one didn't deal with the issue. And then you had Egan and Willis later on over a comparable matter, which goes to the High Court and doesn't resolve it any further. So we have this situation where it's never been totally proven through black letter law, but the executive doesn't want to test it because they're afraid they might lose. And so it's like, there you are. Have our papers, damn you. And that's the approach, because really no one's sure exactly how it's going to go, because parliamentary privilege is very important, but nevertheless executive claims a qualified privilege, which they would say, and that's what you had. You actually literally had three separate judgments. And so the executive or the executive government subsequent have grudgingly bit their teeth and handed over documents because they don't want to test the principle in a court of law, fearing that they will lose. And not only that they'll lose the privilege which applies to cabinet documents. And that's the real $64 question. Of course, getting slightly off topic, how long cabinet records in New South Wales are held for 20 years. Mm-hmm. In New Zealand, they're held for 2 weeks, which is another reason why the executive doesn't want to test it, because they're afraid that the New Zealand situation could lead to the court saying, well, Here we have another Westminster jurisdiction where you don't need to have cabinet documents held for 20 years when they're being voluntarily released after 2 weeks.
We're going to have to move on to our final session for the evening, and that is about the rise of the crossbench and minor parties. In 1981, the election saw the first 2 minor party members join the council, Elizabeth Kirby of the Australian Democrats and Fred Nile of Call to Australia. And in the decades to follow, minor party representation in the council continued to grow, including new representation from the Greens, from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers and from a range of other parties. Indeed, since 1988, no government has held a majority in the council, which has made the crossbench a critical feature of the chamber and ensures that negotiation and compromise make the council an effective upper house. Today, our crossbench includes representatives of the Greens and the Shooters and Fishers and Farmers, but also the Animal Justice Party, the Libertarian Party, One Nation, the Legalised Cannabis Party and 2 independents. So, Dr Phelps, we'll start with you on this one. Noting that no government has held a majority in the upper house since 1988,
and
making the
almost certainly never hold one again.
Making the crossbench a particularly unique feature of the Legislative Council, what contribution do you think that minor parties make to democracy in our upper house and in our state?
Minor parties are an annoying roadblock, but you'll never get rid of them. So this is the problem which major parties don't. By the way, I just do note for Ben that the National Party is in fact a minor party too. The mere fact that they're in coalition doesn't hide the fact that they are a minor party. They're arguably the most effective minor party in Australia's history. Greens are probably a close second, but they're the most effective minor party. Governments, and certainly Liberal governments, and Labor's left, I will say, has the same attitude towards the Greens, and that is there's an indignation. How dare people not vote for us? You know, if they're Conservatives, they should be voting for us. If they're Progressives, they should be voting for Labor left. And these parties come up. And the argument is not these parties are terrible, they don't have any mandate, they should listen to us and just do what they say. There should be a bit more introspection than that. Say, what are the major parties not providing, which the minor parties are providing? And then you have to make an assessment, can we actually take back some of that ground? And there might be the cases, no, you can't. You can't. The general convergence towards the centre of politics from both the Labor and Liberal parties means that, and the National Party too, means that there is now a far more open field, particularly in a list system like we have in the upper house, for that individual organisations or individual parties which represent particular things which the major parties are not delivering for people to capture their vote. And I'm sure you're all well aware of the principle that people vote for one party in the lower house and then they'll deviate and vote for another party in the upper house. Why? Because I might be a progressive leftist and I'll vote for Labor in my local area, but you know what? I want the Greens because they're a little bit more progressive and left than the Labor Party is. You might be a conservative shooter, so you'll vote for your local Liberal in the lower house, but you know what? Shooters, fishers and farmers are more representative of my interest in my gun matters. Or you're more libertarian, so you vote for John Ruddock. Or you might be a conservative who likes small government and tough economic policy, but you love cats, so you vote for animal justice in the upper house. And this phenomenon is something which is not going away, and indeed it's only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. While you have the option of doing so, people are choosing that option. Minor parties are not dying, which then leaves the question is, what do you do? How do you deal with them? And as I like to say earlier, you can't go through, and it certainly was the case in our government, in the Liberal government, where there was an arrogant disregard for minor parties. It's like, we are the government, we have a mandate, you should be doing what you want us to do. To be fair, there are some minor parties. Fred Nile always said, I'll vote for whatever government legislation comes forward because it's government and I respect the mandate of government unless it affronts the moral sensibilities of myself and my party. That's one way of approaching it. But there's another more universal way across a whole range of jurisdictions around the world, and that is, okay, we want to get this tax reform through, let's go to the Greens because the Greens alone will give us the votes which can get it through. What do you want? Okay, that's fair enough. We don't care about that. You vote for us, we'll vote for it. The Greens worked together with the Coalition to reform the electoral laws in the first term of the government I was in, over everyone else in the chamber. The Greens and the Coalition worked together to reform the electoral laws. Kate Fairman was there.
Well, that doesn't sound like an arrogant disregard of minor parties.
But
then.
that was a good example. But
we
then,
work with
from then on, it's sort of, we lost that way. But because we had mutuality of interest, largely due to Lee Rhiannon, of course, to be fair, and her pushing for electoral
I will
funding
throw
reform.
to, sorry.
No, but I just will say this,
Very
and
quickly.
that is, governments have to understand that we are now in a situation of permanent and entrenched minority government. You can disregard that, but you'll disregard it at your own peril, and you will only have gridlock for your legislation. Alternatively, you can engage in horse trading. Because if you don't, you're only going to have the most anodyne legislation. The alternative, of course, is to work with the Labor Party.
I'm going to
or the
correct
opposition.
you there, though, because we don't horse trade. The Greens don't horse trade. What we do is we will work to actually come to some sort of compromise position that suits us both.
But if we could give you
there's
something,
no horse trading.
if we could give you something,
Not on something
that you
completely
wanted,
different. No, it's just not
you
how it works.
wouldn't do that.
No,
the feds,
absolutely
see,
not.
the feds were different. The feds will do that.
All right.
The feds will do that.
Abigail.
Federal Greens will do that.
I think so. From my perspective, I think that people are voting for minor parties for two reasons. I think they vote for them because of the belief in the policy, but they also vote for minor parties because they don't want the government to have too much power. And what I've experienced being on the crossbench is that you've got two parties, one that's in power and one that wants to be in power soon, and so doesn't want to do anything to, in terms of powers of the House and that sort of thing, to really cramp their style when they get in next time. So you've got two very similar parties who have an idea about how they want to govern. And I think that what the crossbench does is it holds both of them accountable. So even when we are in, this is what I've been trying to get across to the now opposition, when they say, why are you looking into things that we did when we were in power? So the crossbench holds both of you to account. We hold the government of the day to account, but we also hold previous governments and the governments perhaps to be to account. Because what we're trying to do is to actually keep a system that has integrity and accountability. So I think sometimes we don't give people enough credit when they're voting. They're not just voting because they like cats, for instance. They're voting because they actually think that it's a healthy thing for democracy to have more voices in the room than fewer.
Why do you think, Robert? Why are people voting for minor parties?
Well, I can only think about it in terms of my party in that sense. I think John Tingle got elected in 1995, and I think he brought into our party a process more taught by example, I think, rather than trying to lecture us, but to listen to all sides, to consider what's being said, to think about it, and above all, don't forget your principles, your policies, and think about your constituents always. And I think that's why, and some people have said to me, well, you guys always get re-elected. Why do you do that? Well, the reality is we have a very clear focus on who our constituents are. In some cases, we might actually pick up constituents along the way who see their causes as lost causes. Taxi drivers, for example, whether it's the greyhound racing industry is a good example, and I could pick up a number of others. The reality is that the crossbench has a role, but because we are, and our particular party is, and I know the Greens are, and I know Animal Justice are very, very focused on who their constituents are, they know who they are as a party. And when government or opposition comes along, you have to, everything they say to you has to be thought through in those terms. And I must say, as far as our party's concerned, the last government was very bad at doing that. It was hopeless, in fact, especially when it came to our party, because there was an arrogance of power there. You people, you don't matter, just do what we tell you to do. Well, I can tell you that's the last thing you should be saying to a party like ours, for example. We're not going to do what you tell us to do. We'll do what we think is in the best interests of our constituents and what we think is in the best interests of the people of New South Wales. And the bill that Chris was talking about, the change to the stamp duty, our analysis of it was that it was a nice little growth tax that was going to be put in, and every government would benefit from it, and it had to be opposed in all terms, because in the long term it would basically be a situation where government would own everything and we'd all be paying rent long term monthly to the government to own our own properties. And yes, the price of property has gone up and stamp duty has become ridiculous, but that's the reality of it. Every government, and New South Wales is no different, wants to get away from the lumpiness of stamp duty income as a direct but period tax, and put in a nice smooth land tax that's going to apply to everybody. And guess what? It's going to be indexed as well, so they'll never have to think about it again. Well, I can't think of anything worse from a family point of view. And that was the conclusion we came to in our party. So John Tingle taught us to think those things through and work on it and think about not just our constituents, although obviously our focus is with them because we want to get re-elected, but to think about the big picture. Where is that going to take us? Now, whether you agree with us or not doesn't really matter. We've got some seats there, we've got some votes, and we'll take advantage of that.
Well, before we go to questions from the audience, we'll, I think, leave the final word to Minister Houssos. There have been a lot of allegations thrown around about how governments deal with the crossbench. You are the government now. You are a senior minister in the government. What are your reflections on this?
Yeah, look, I think my experience of the upper house is, as we spoke about earlier, it's quite a collegiate atmosphere. And I think that if you respectfully engage with the crossbench, then I find and understanding where they're coming from and appreciating that we've all been democratically elected to represent the people of New South Wales. Now we have come to it from different perspectives, but the approach that I've always tried to have is to find a way to work with everyone who's been elected. And we might have, and I can probably call out Dr Phelps here. I did eventually, after we'd been in the parliament for many years together, find that we both don't agree on electronic voting. Also, Mr Borsak, and I should acknowledge Mr President, that we were all serving on the Electoral Matters Committee. And it's that kind of work together that finds a way through really complex policy and some difficult decisions. I actually don't think that government mandate is quite as black and white as Dr Phelps has outlined. I think that the government is elected fundamentally to govern on behalf of the people of New South Wales with their values and approach the problems and things that come up over the course of a 4-year term in that way. But it doesn't mean that you can't have input from the other people who are elected. And I think that makes ultimately for better government and ultimately for better policy for the people of New South Wales. I actually think it's really clever that we have a different system in the lower house and the upper house. We do both reflect the community equally, but we just reflect different parts of it. And I think I really respect the institution of the upper house. I'm really excited to be part of the celebrations as the Bicentenary, but I think it's really interesting to be considering about how much we've changed over the course of that time.
So on that note, that excellent and very positive and upbeat note, we have come to the end of the formal section. Now, I note also, by the way, we've hit 7:30, but I know that there are certainly a few people who want to ask questions. We won't be able to have too many, but who's got a question that they'd like to ask one of the panellists? Sir, in the middle there. There'll be a microphone brought to you.
My question, just a quick question. You mentioned that the third woman elected to the Legislative Council was indirectly elected. How do you get indirectly elected?
Please, Dr Phelps.
What happened was originally it was appointed. In other words, the government of the day would say, we want you, and you. And that's how Lang tried to swamp the upper house in the late 1920s. One of the ways around that was the incoming Conservative government introduced a system whereby all members of the lower house and those members of the upper house who weren't standing for election would vote for the people who were standing for election. So you had parliamentarians voting for that particular cohort of incoming members into the Legislative Council. So it was called indirect election, but it was basically parliamentarians voting for other parliamentarians to fill the spaces which you had as part of the rotation through council.
And I think we can all agree that we're thankful that that doesn't occur anymore. Who's got another question? Yep, up the back there.
Stephen Frappel, I'm one of the clerk assistants in the council. The council peaked at a membership of, I think, 125 members in 1932. Then, when this indirect election of the council was occurring, it went back to 60 members. I think it was referred to earlier, it went down to 45 in 1988, and now it's at 42. So it's at its lowest level for probably 100 years or something like that. At the same time, we've heard the discussion about just what an important role the council plays. We've heard the discussion about the committees, how important they are and how stretched members are on committees. And we've heard about the budget estimates. And we've heard about diversity and bringing, how important the quorum is in the council. I'd be interested in any reflections. The council it's the second largest upper house in Australia at 42 members after the Senate. But we don't have the nexus that they have in Canberra, where the Senate is set at basically half of the House of Representatives. Obviously, the council isn't half of the Legislative Assembly here. Be interested in any reflections on, is 42 members enough?
Good question. I promise that wasn't a Dorothy Dixer, by the way. We'll start with Dr Burgmann.
Can I just make a point, because it was also referred to earlier, I think by Robert, that the Senate is not a democratically elected chamber because you have 12 senators from Tasmania and 12 from New South Wales. It is, as Paul Keating pointed out, unrepresentative swill. And no, it is seriously probably the most unrepresentative chamber we have in Australia, because the difference, you need 400 votes in Tasmania, to get elected to the Senate.
Your family in Tasmania.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, it's extraordinary when it's referred to as a democratic chamber, because it's not. Whereas I do agree, although I have problems with upper houses, that New South Wales has the most democratically elected chamber, because it is proportional representation at its purest, actually.
Chris, is 42 members enough?
I actually think we probably do need to expand both chambers. I think that we've been stuck at 93 members of the Legislative Assembly now since 92, was it? Something. Early 90s sometime. So you do have members that represent quite large electorates, as you do in Canberra as well. I think the House of Representatives in Canberra is some of the largest in terms of population electorates in the world. But I think if you are increasing the electorates, the number of electorates in the Legislative Assembly, that you should also increase in the Legislative Council. Ideologically, I think that we should probably have larger legislatures and smaller executives. I think that, and we were guilty of this when we were in government too, that it was sort of an ever-expanding...
Guilty, we were reprehensible. We got to a stage where every member in the coalition party room, bar one, was either a minister, Parlsec, whip, or had some sort of extra income provided to them. Why? To keep them quiet and complacent.
Yeah.
Everyone in the Liberal National Party room, bar one.
Also to get around the salary cap you imposed.
We're going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, so we'll ask if there's one final question. Yes, up the back. Actually, no, I'm sorry, sir. We will go to a lady in the middle there.
We touched a lot about community representation in the Parliament and the Council. Do you believe that young people in the community and the issues ongoing that I'm sure everyone's aware about is heard and effectively and adequately represented and worked on in the community? Sorry, in the Parliament?
We might start with you, Abigail.
I don't think so. I think, so I had the youth portfolio for the Greens for a while, and one of the things that I tried very hard to do was to directly speak the words of younger people. But I think that's no substitute for having younger people being, directly represented or, being in Parliament. And I've been a long-time supporter of lowering the voting age to 16, so that we can enfranchise that sort of group of very switched-on people. And I think, we've talked before about how we came into Parliament without any experience of how to be parliamentarians. We have some experience, I have a whole career I had, and that's great, that's informed me. But that's no more a valuable experience than somebody who is coming in, at 20 years old, who has had a wealth of their own experience and their own life circumstances that they want to then have represented in Parliament. I think we do have an age problem in all parliaments.
Chris, I think you were the youngest member when you were elected. What's your perspective on this?
We have 6 members under 35, which I think is a very good thing. But I think just like you want the Parliament to represent or accurately reflect the population when it comes to women, when it comes to multicultural diversity, when it comes to LGBTI diversity, of course you want the Parliament to represent the people and reflect the fact that we have different age groups in society. So we probably could do better in terms of getting some younger people in. We've done, I think, a better job more recently, probably at the last state election. There was a new cohort of young members that did come in. And it's because the issues mix is very different that you're dealing with. Like I've been very outspoken and very passionate about housing, about getting more Gen Z and millennials into the housing market. I think that that's a different perspective potentially from where some of the older members of Parliament might be coming from. So I think it's very important that we do have young members of Parliament and that not everyone is over 65.
You, sir, down the back.
Thank you. If we were to create a school type of report card for the upper house, what would be the 3 most important measures for your success?
Punctuality.
I'm going to ask...
Sobriety.
So when you ask, are they for members or for the House as a whole?
For the House.
For the House as a whole.
Has potential.
I might ask each of the panellists, starting from Meredith, to.
So what's being asked? What good things have we done?
No.
Successful upper house.
What makes for a successful upper house?
If we were to measure you, report card style.
Well, it really does depend whether you're the government wanting to get your legislation that you've been elected to do through the upper house.
If I'm a member of the public.
Yes, but are you a Green voting member of the public or a Labor voting member of the public? I mean, it's a bit like asking what the public interest is. So you don't really know. I mean, if you're a person who supports a minority party, then the upper house is very successful in terms of representing you. And I will say that.
Abigail.
I think, to me, taking a step away from who's actually the members in the upper house, I think a functional upper house is one that allows all of those members to have a say and to put their agendas for their people onto the business of the week. And so in 2019, which Courtney alluded to, there was it was mainly crossbench and Labor at the time that came together to improve our standing orders, to give the minor parties and the opposition more opportunity to hold the government to account, to speak to motions, to do all of that sort of thing. And that ability to hear from everyone, not just those with the most power in the room, I think is what makes an effective and democratic institution.
What do you think, Courtney?
I think we represent the community really well. Like I said earlier, I think it's sometimes a bit messy. It's not always, can get a bit raucous. But I think ultimately we do. We reflect the community, and I think we get there in the end, for sure.
Robert, what does a successful upper house look like?
Well, I said punctuality at the start, but that wasn't just a throwaway line. I think it's a very, very hard question to answer because of the diversity of the parties, diversity of the individuals. You've got to look at the whole of what the House does, especially since the government, nor in fact the opposition, control what the crossbench does. And no one can really tell what might come in one end from the lower house and what's going to come out the other end. And it really gets down to whether you support the government, as Meredith is saying, or whether you support the opposition and you want to see a result from them in terms of however that is reflected, or whether you support one of the minor parties like ours. It's a very, very difficult question to answer. You have to look at, I believe, how is the committee system working? What is the upper house saying? What is it doing? what reports are coming out. And there's just such a monstrous amount of work being done, and I'm not just trying to pat ourselves on the back, but there's an awful lot of professionally generated opinion coming out, whether it's by way of committee, whether it's by way of budget estimates, whether it's standing up in the House, debating, question time. It just goes on, and especially now since 2019 and the ongoing significant changes that were made to the standing orders of the House. Meredith referred to the fact that, you said 53 years to get your change through. I think it only took 3 or 4 years to do the biggest overhaul of the standing orders that our upper house has seen in probably 40 years. And for me to actually sit here now and say, well, tell you all what's changed, I literally can't, because so much has. It changed so much from the time I came in here, and even from the time that Tingle came in here, who told me at the time, because I was chairman of the party, I came in here reasonably regularly, I said, when do you get a chance to put a bill up? He said, well, our names go in a hat. They call it the chook raffle. And if I get drawn out once a year, I might actually get up and talk to a bill. Now, you have to look at what it was like then, back in 95, 96 and so on, and what it is now. And now it is it's a difficult place for the opposition to be, and it's even a more difficult place for a government to be. And they have to learn how to deal with the upper house. And that's largely reflective of the way the crossbench, with the cooperation in 2019, changed the standing orders to make the House more of a house of accountability and transparency, and not control. It's all there.
Courtney. We now get a whole day every sitting week.
I think it goes to the points that Robert just made, goes to, like, we're here celebrating 200 years of the upper house, and I think Meredith reflected on, for a long period of time, it was felt that it just needed to continue to operate as it had in the past. I think the real strength of the upper house, particularly over the last 4 years, or certainly over the period that I've been there, but particularly the last 4 to 5 years, has been the ability to better reflect the community, to continue to modernise and to continue to update the way that we do things to make them more relevant. And I think that's actually the strength of the upper house, and that's why I would say we are doing a good job. We in opposition or in government, you're holding the government to account, but you're also genuinely investigating a range of really big and complex policy issues and representing the people of New South Wales. So I think that ability to reinvent ourselves and to continue to update, which we haven't always been good at over the course of our 200-year history, I think it's really important to highlight that tonight.
Well, I can't think of a more appropriate way to finish the evening. Thank you, Courtney. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'd agree that that was an insightful, vigorous and entertaining session that we've had this evening. Please thank Peter Phelps, Chris Rath, Abigail Boyd, Robert Borsak, Courtney Houssos and Meredith Burgmann. Can I also thank the Black Rod team, who've done such a wonderful job tonight of pulling this whole thing together. As we commemorate the Legislative Council's bicentenary this year, it's our hope that in reflecting on the past, celebrating the many achievements of our council, will create a platform to imagine how we can continue to forge a diverse, representative and effective upper house into the future. And I think tonight you've seen diversity in all its glory. Thank you for being here.